Hello everyone, we're doing Life Over Coffee. I am Rick Thomas. This is Daniel Berger. We're right in the middle of a series on suicide. Some of you are wanting Daniel's book. We do have it available, and so all you have to do is to click the link